In a world of wealth and grandeur, behind the glossy surface of affluence and elegance there often lurks a shadowy truth. This is not the tale of luxury and leisure it might first appear to be, but one of illusion, deceit, and the quiet agony that unfolds behind closed doors. At the center of it all is a young woman named Clara, who had unknowingly stepped into a life she never asked for. Having married into the esteemed Lancaster family, a dynasty known for its towering legacy and immense fortune, Clara thought she might at last find security, perhaps even happiness. But what awaited her was a household where trust was a scarce commodity and every corner harbored secrets dark enough to crush the faintest hopes of love. From the very start, Clara sensed something was wrong. It was as if every smile hid a smirk, every kind word masked a scheme. Here, affection was nothing but a strategic move in a silent battle for power, and betrayal was just another tool to climb higher. Feelings burned hot and fast like summer storms, unpredictable and often cruel. What was once called love would soon bear an uncanny resemblance to hatred, and what began as a family union teetered on the edge of emotional war. But in such a treacherous world, who would break first? Would it be Clara, overwhelmed by manipulation and pressure? Or would someone else crumble beneath the weight of their own lies? With every revelation, loyalties shifted and relationships fractured. What remained after the truth surfaced was often unrecognizable, barely resembling the bonds that once held people together. There were lessons tucked between the tragedy and the drama. Lessons about the danger of greed, the resilience of a woman scorned, the redemptive but often painful nature of love, and the heavy price of betrayal. This tale is not merely a romantic drama, it's an emotional odyssey through manipulation, sacrifice, and self-discovery. Clara's journey began not with a wedding, but with a slap, a heavy, jarring one, loud enough to echo across the room and sting her soul. "What have I done wrong?" she cried out, her voice trembling not just from the pain but from a lifetime of buried frustration. Her father, Mr. Bramwell, loomed over her with eyes that had long since forgotten how to show warmth. "How dare you question my decision about your marriage?" he thundered. "What do you even have in this family? Nothing." This wasn't the first time Clara had felt the back of her father's hand, nor was it the first time she had dared to ask why her life had to be sacrificed for someone else's plans. All she wanted to know was why she was being forced into marriage with a man she barely knew, let alone loved. "Your younger sister would have been grateful to be in your shoes," her father growled, "but it was the Lancaster family who specifically requested you instead of Celeste. You should be grateful." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Grateful?" she hissed. "You say I'm not qualified, yet they asked for me. Who exactly are you trying to fool? I'm not a little girl anymore and you know it." Of course it made sense to protect Celeste. She was the golden child, the one adorned with affection and praise, the symbol of perfection in the Bramwell family. Clara, on the other hand, was merely a placeholder, only useful when the first choice wasn't available. "If you refuse to marry Mr. Lancaster, I swear I'll make this house unbearable for you. You'll leave here with shame," her father threatened, his voice like ice. Clara lifted her chin defiantly. What greater shame is there than marrying a man who can't even respond to his own name? Her voice cracked with fury and disbelief. Mr. Bramwell's hand rose again, fingers twitching with rage, but before it landed, the door flung open. In walked Veronica, Clara's stepmother, with her ever-practiced smile and a tone dipped in artificial sweetness. "Darling, are you still using violence? I thought we agreed that this had to stop." Clara nearly gagged at the display. No one was buying Veronica's sudden concern, not even Clara herself. Veronica was her late mother's half-sister, the same woman who had smeared her mother's name and forced her out of her own home. Now, with Clara's mother gone, Veronica was hungry for full control, and getting rid of Clara seemed to be her next step. She approached with faux gentleness, placing a hand on Clara's back. "Clara, I know you want what's best for the family." Her voice was syrupy, but her eyes were calculating. "Mr. Lancaster is our ticket to freedom," Veronica added. "Don't you want us to live like we did before?" Clara's heart boiled with fury. Her life, her future, was being bartered like livestock. And for what? Comfort? Luxury? He spat. "If you both gave a single damn about me, you wouldn't force me to marry someone I don't love." Her father's voice cracked like a whip. "You'd better shut that mouth before I do it for you." But Clara wasn't afraid anymore. She turned to Veronica, her gaze unwavering. If marrying into the Lancaster family is all you want, why don't you offer your precious daughter Celeste? She'd make a perfect bride. The truth stung, and it hung in the air for a long moment. In truth, Clara might have considered the marriage if the groom were whole and healthy, but he wasn't. The young heir to the Lancaster fortune, Isaac, had returned from studying overseas only to suffer a horrific accident, a reckless driver slamming into him. Since then, rumors claimed he was in a coma, and wouldn't last long. Her stepmother's voice broke the silence. You've been wandering jobless ever since you finished college. Marrying Mr. Lancaster will give you everything. Clara clenched her jaw. She wanted to run, escape, but her younger brother was still in the hospital, and the bills kept piling up. She couldn't abandon him. Not now. So she gave in. Because the threats were growing darker. Because her brother's health was failing. Because she was trapped. And so the wedding day arrived. Clara never even saw Isaac during the ceremony. The vows were spoken in absence. With trembling fingers and a soul weighted by confusion, she signed the marriage certificate, legally bound to a man who straddled the line between life and death. The drive to the Lancaster estate felt surreal. The mansion stood isolated, perched high above the city in a district reserved for society's elite. When the car stopped, a servant greeted her with cold politeness and led her inside. "Madam, please follow me." Upstairs, she entered a room dimly lit, yet extravagant beyond anything she'd known. And there, on the massive bed, lay her husband, Isaac Lancaster. Even unconscious, his features were striking. A sharp nose, strong jawline, and brows etched in quiet strength. But there was something unsettling about his stillness. Something that made Clara uneasy. She hesitated, staring at him. He looked like a man not to be trifled with. There was power in his expression, even in sleep. For a moment, Clara pitied him. It was tragic, really, to be born into so much, only to end up like this, a beautiful shell with no soul, awake inside. Her fingers grazed his brow, down his cheek, finally resting on his dry lips. He was magnetic, even in silence. In a quiet wish she didn't dare voice aloud, Clara hoped he would awaken that night, just so she wouldn't have to face this alone. But when his eyes fluttered open, she recoiled in terror. "I thought he was in a coma," she whispered, heart racing as she scrambled toward the window. His gaze, hollow yet aware, followed her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. A knock at the door startled her further. A young maid entered, unimpressed by Clara's distress. "He opened his eyes," Clara gasped. "He's awake." But the maid scoffed. "This isn't a playground. Stop your nonsense and care for the young master properly." Clara protested, but the girl brushed her off, delivering one final blow before leaving. "You didn't marry him. You were sold to him. Your family took a great sum. You're just another servant now." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She had suspected they were capable of many things, but not this, not selling her like a commodity. And yet, despite it all, Clara made a vow that night. If she had been reduced to a pawn in someone else's game, she would learn to play it well. She would survive, no matter what it cost her. As Mrs. Josephine turned sharply and nearly collided with Clara in the hallway, her brows furrowed. "Madam, where are you going? You were told to stay put until I returned," she snapped. Clara, still trembling from what she had just witnessed in the room, tried to compose herself. I think Isaac is awake. He moved his hand just now," she replied, her voice uncertain yet laced with urgency, hoping the woman would take her seriously. But Josephine barely acknowledged the concern. She moved straight to the bed, examining Isaac's seemingly lifeless body with the cold detachment of someone too used to disappointment. Clara watched as the older woman rolled her eyes, her sigh heavy with disdain. "You're already becoming a nuisance," Josephine muttered under her breath, though loud enough for Clara to hear. "Here," she said curtly, handing Clara a thick file. "This is Isaac's daily care schedule. Make sure you follow it." Clara took the file and opened it, only to gape at the exhaustive list inside. For a man who hadn't moved in months, Isaac Lancaster had a surprisingly long list of needs, from early morning cleaning and hygiene to dietary instructions and scheduled body movements. Everything was mapped out to the smallest detail. She noticed the first task: bathe him and change his clothes before breakfast. "Am I supposed to do this by myself?" she asked hesitantly, dread building in her chest. "Of course. You're his wife now, aren't you?" Josephine said with a smirk before turning on her heel and walking away. Clara felt her cheeks flush. The thought of bathing a man she barely knew, especially one she'd never spoken to, was mortifying. She had never seen a naked man before, and the idea of seeing Isaac's body in such a vulnerable state was overwhelming. And yet, a conflicting sensation stirred inside her: curiosity. Despite everything, Isaac had a magnetic allure. From the moment she'd arrived, even in his coma, she could tell he was striking. Tall, well-built, with chiseled features and skin like smooth bronze. It was cruel irony that she would be allowed to see and touch this man's body, and yet he couldn't even speak to her, let alone look at her. Shaking off the tangled mess of emotions, Clara gathered her strength. She couldn't back down now. Carefully, she moved Isaac to the large tub, aided by 2 male servants. The water was warm, but his skin felt cold against her fingertips. As she washed him gently, her thoughts wandered. "Why don't you just wake up already?" she murmured, her eyes scanning his peaceful face. This would be so much easier. After cleaning him and changing his clothes, she returned him to the bed with the servant's help. Physically and emotionally drained, Clara collapsed beside him, letting out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "If you survive this," she whispered, "you owe me big time." But rest would not come. Before her eyes could even flutter shut, there was a knock at the door. "Madam, the mistress of the house wishes to speak with you," came the voice of another servant. Clara groaned inwardly. She wasn't ready for this. Her body ached and her head felt as heavy as a stone, but she couldn't refuse. In the lavish sitting room downstairs, a regal woman sat stiffly, her eyes piercing as Clara entered. It was Rebecca Lancaster, Isaac's mother. Her gaze held judgment and her lips curled ever so slightly in disdain. "So, you're Clara?" she asked, her tone cold. "I trust you understand your purpose in this house?" Clara nodded cautiously. Rebecca wasted no time. "Let me remind you, in case you forget, you were bought. That makes you ours, to do with as we see fit. If you ever grow tired of this marriage or start entertaining foolish thoughts about other men, I will personally ensure your disgrace is legendary." The venom in her voice chilled Clara to the bone, but before she could respond, a deep voice interrupted. "That won't be necessary." Clara turned in shock. It was Henry Lancaster, Isaac's father. He stood behind them, his stern expression softening only slightly as he looked at his wife. "Enough, Rebecca. She is still here, and that's what matters." Rebecca scoffed. "I was merely teaching her the expectations of a proper wife." Clara, trying to ease the tension, added quickly, "Mrs. Lancaster was giving me instructions on how best to care for Isaac." Henry nodded approvingly. "Don't worry about her harsh words. I can see you're a decent woman, well brought up. I trust my son is in good hands." Clara bowed slightly in gratitude and excused herself, eager to retreat, but as she neared Isaac's room, strange noises stopped her in her tracks. A voice, low, sneering, filtered through the door. "Brother, I've always admired you, but right now, you're as good as dead. What does a corpse need with a wife anyway?" Clara's blood ran cold. She burst into the room, only to find a man, tall, lean, and unfamiliar, leaning over Isaac's body, his hand curled around Isaac's neck. "What are you doing?" she screamed, rushing forward and shoving him aside. The man stumbled, straightened his clothes with calculated grace, and glared at her. "Who the hell are you, and what are you doing here?" "I should ask you the same thing," Clara snapped. "This is my husband's room." He scoffed. "I'm Kendrick, Isaac's younger brother." Something in his tone sent alarm bells ringing in Clara's head. "Then act like a brother. Don't come near this room again without permission." But Kendrick only grinned and stepped toward her. "It must be lonely lying next to a man who can't move or speak. Why don't you visit my room tonight? I promise, I'm a much better companion." Clara recoiled. "You're disgusting." The grin vanished. His hand shot out, gripping her arm painfully. "Everything Isaac has should be mine, including his woman." Clara didn't hesitate. She kicked him squarely, sending him reeling backward. Enraged, he shoved her hard. She stumbled and struck her head against the edge of Isaac's bed. Pain erupted across her skull, but she forced herself upright. "You dare touch me again, and I'll tear you apart," she hissed. But before Kendrick could reply, A groan escaped from the bed. Both froze. Isaac was moving, his eyelids fluttered open slowly and his eyes, sharp, alive, settled on them. Kendrick's face drained of color. Without a word, he bolted from the room. Clara, stunned, turned back to Isaac and gently touched his forehead, where a light bruise had formed. To her shock, his hand shot up and grabbed hers with surprising strength. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Why are you in my room?" Clara's voice trembled. I'm your wife." He released her hand immediately. Clara stumbled back, gasping. Then, in a burst of panic and disbelief, she ran from the room, screaming at the top of her lungs, "He's awake! He's finally awake!" The house erupted in chaos. Servants ran, family members gathered, and the mansion buzzed with the news. Isaac Lancaster, the heir who had been comatose for months, was conscious. Everyone appeared elated. Except Kendrick, whose forced smile could barely conceal his dread. Later, Isaac sat in the drawing room, flanked by his parents, listening as the family doctor expressed astonishment over his miraculous recovery. "His vitals are perfect," the doctor declared. "With rehabilitation, he should make a full recovery." Kendrick attempted to slip out, citing a business meeting, but Henry was quick to reprimand him. "Your brother has returned from the brink of death, and you're leaving? Foreign investors?" Kendrick muttered weakly. He shuffled over to Isaac. "It's good to have you back, brother." Isaac scanned the room, his gaze finally settling on Clara. "Who is she?" Rebecca motioned for Clara to step forward. "This is your wife." Clara's throat tightened, as Isaac looked her over with a chill in his eyes. That night, when they returned to their room, he spoke coldly. "You don't belong here, get out." Heart pounding, Clara left, nearly colliding with Mrs. Josephine in the hallway. Understanding her pain, the woman offered her a place to rest. It was the first peaceful sleep Clara had since arriving at the Lancaster estate. But morning brought new challenges. A maid summoned her abruptly. Isaac had demanded breakfast. Clara prepared the food, but as she served it, Isaac sneered. "You can't even make noodles properly." He shoved the plate away, humiliated. Clara fled, tears streaming down her cheeks. Later that day, he stormed into her room. "I want my room cleaned, now." Clara was stunned. The mess was outrageous, clearly deliberate, but she cleaned without a word, determined to maintain her composure. Eventually, Isaac assigned her to the maid's quarters. Clara accepted the downgrade with quiet gratitude. At least now she had her own space. Each day, she adjusted to her role as his unwilling servant, but her spirit, though bruised, was not broken. She no longer dared to think of herself as Isaac's wife. The moment he woke up, he treated her like nothing more than a burden. Clara prayed each night that he'd grow tired of her presence and demand a divorce. That hope kept her going. As she cleaned up his mess one afternoon, she heard footsteps and turned. Kendrick stood in the doorway. "I've missed your face," he grinned. "My brother giving you a hard time?" Clara's spine stiffened. "I don't recall inviting you, brother-in-law." Kendrick's eyes darkened. "After what nearly happened between us, I'd think you'd have a different name for me." The kitchen had never felt more suffocating. As Kendrick's words hung in the air like poison, Clara squared her shoulders and glared at him. "And what exactly do you think gives you the right?" she shot back with fire in her eyes. Just then, Isaac strode into the room with deliberate steps. His clenched fists, sharp jawline, and the rage simmering beneath his surface were enough to shift the air pressure in the room. Kendrick's confident smirk faltered. The tension was palpable. "Welcome, brother," Kendrick said awkwardly, extending a hand. "It's nothing. I was only trying to lighten the mood with your wife." Isaac didn't even glance at the hand. His eyes locked onto Clara's, where she stood rigid near the countertop, pretending to busy herself with the cutlery, though her hands trembled. "Clara has plenty to keep her occupied. She doesn't need cheering up," Isaac said coldly, his gaze now fixed sharply on Kendrick. That was the only warning Kendrick needed. Without another word, he backed out of the room and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Clara alone with her volatile husband. Isaac's next words came like a thunderclap. "Stay away from my brother." Later that day, Clara left the mansion, heart heavy and steps uncertain. She made her way to the hospital, determined to see her little brother, Jacob. It had been weeks since her last visit, and she feared what she might find. She fought back tears as the doctor checked Jacob's vitals. The cancer is spreading faster than expected, the doctor said gravely. He needs the surgery soon. Clara's heart clenched. Her stepmother had promised the surgery would be covered after the marriage. But, like so many of her words, it had been a lie. Clara took her brother's hand gently, trying not to disturb the bandage on his arm. "Don't worry about me, sis," Jacob said softly. "I'll be home once they fix me up." Clara bit her lip, tears threatening to spill. She couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth, that she no longer lived in their family home, that she was now the reluctant wife of a cold-hearted man who didn't care whether she lived or died. She lay beside him on the narrow hospital bed, watching his frail chest rise and fall, and her mind drifted to her late mother's company. The business was dying, and it was time she considered selling her small shares to afford Jacob's surgery. Back at the estate, Isaac paced his study. Something about seeing Clara and Kendrick together had ignited a foreign feeling inside him, something dangerously close to jealousy. He tried to shake it off, instead fantasizing about giving her the divorce she no doubt wanted, but even then, a smirk crept onto his face. He would offer her a deal, something irresistible, and make her dance to his tune one last time. A timid knock pulled him out of his thoughts. A maid stepped inside, eyes lowered. "Sir, she's not in the villa." Isaac's head turned slowly. Who gave her permission to leave? The maid opened her mouth but closed it again, clearly too scared to speak. Isaac's expression turned to stone. "Tell her to see me the moment she returns." When Clara came back that evening, she felt the weight of Isaac's stare the moment she walked in. Her steps faltered as her eyes landed on a stack of documents on the center table. "Where did you go?" His voice was hoarse and commanding. I went to the hospital," she stammered. His eyes narrowed. Then, without warning, he barked, "I want my car washed, now." Clara blinked, shocked. "But it's raining heavily." "Is that supposed to be a problem?" he snapped. "Everyone in this house knows their duties." Lightning cracked outside, and Clara's stomach sank. She left the room, her head low, and changed into something simpler. Before heading out, she was stopped by Mrs. Josephine, who handed her a steaming plate of pepper soup. "You haven't eaten all day," the older woman said with a kind smile. Clara took it gratefully. Mrs. Josephine was the only one in that mansion who treated her like a human being. After finishing the soup, she nodded at the reminder to go wash the car. Outside, the rain soaked her to the bone as she scrubbed the vehicle, her fingers numb and her heart aching. From behind the glass, Isaac watched with a cruel smile. He wanted her to break. If she left on her own, he could avoid the trouble of divorce and the shame of explaining it to his parents. Another clap of thunder sent Clara running for the nearest shed. She leaned against the wall, her tears mixing with rain. "I'm a slave," she whispered bitterly. "My own family sold me, disguised it as marriage, and washed their hands clean." Eventually, she finished the task and stumbled back inside. She changed into dry clothes and collapsed onto her bed, only to be awakened by a dream's chilling cry. Groggy, she rubbed her eyes and forced herself up. It was nearly dinner time. Isaac would not tolerate any delay. She was still dazed when she bumped into him in the hallway. "What took you so long?" he barked. "I was just..." "Enough." His voice sliced through the air. "Go make dinner." Clara rushed to the kitchen only to find herself mocked again. Isaac shoved her aside. "Have you gone blind? Can't even see where you're going?" "I'm sorry," she began. "Save your apologies," he snapped, cutting her off. Clara clutched her stomach suddenly. A cold, strange sensation rippled through her body, the result of hours in the rain. Still, she pushed the feeling aside and focused on preparing the meal. She had to stay strong. For Jacob. But her legs gave out. The floor rushed toward her, and the next thing she knew, she was on the ground. Isaac looked down at her. Another accident, another clumsy moment. He had promised himself he wouldn't touch her, that he wouldn't show her compassion, but something shifted as he looked at her fragile body. Her hair lay like silk over her face, revealing a fresh cut on her forehead. Without thinking, he scooped her up and carried her to her room. "What happened to her?" came a voice at the door. Startled, Isaac turned to see his father standing in the doorway. "Dad, I didn't realize you were home." "You would have if you ever picked up your phone," came the tired reply. His father moved closer to examine Clara. What happened? Isaac ran a hand through his hair. I found her like this. A few minutes ago. That was a lie and he knew it. But he also knew what would happen if his father found out he had sent her to wash a car in the rain. His father had grown fond of Clara. Too fond. Clara's eyes opened slowly. Her father-in-law gave her a warm smile. Is that how much you missed me? Isaac stared at the tender exchange. His father brushed Clara's hair gently away from her face. Isaac felt something twist inside him, a strange, unfamiliar emotion he couldn't name. I think I slipped climbing the stairs, Clara said with a weak smile. His father looked back at Isaac, unimpressed. You should have called the family doctor. What if she's seriously hurt? Isaac turned away, seething internally. She could be in danger for all I care, he thought. I just want her gone. I'm fine, sir, no need to worry, Clara added quickly, surprising Isaac with how convincingly she lied. She tried to sit up but winced. Her limbs were weak and her body limp. I'm calling the doctor, Isaac's father said firmly. At that very moment, Madame Josephine entered the room with the family physician in tow. Have you been nauseous lately? The doctor asked while shining a light into her eyes. Yes, Clara admitted. More than usual. I threw up yesterday, and again today. Isaac's father raised an eyebrow. Why didn't you tell anyone? It didn't seem serious, she replied softly. I didn't want to be a burden. The doctor barely gave Isaac's father time to respond before announcing, she's pregnant. Silence filled the room. Isaac's mouth went dry. Pregnant? But that couldn't be. He hadn't touched her. If she was carrying a child, it wasn't his. That gave him an idea. If she was pregnant with another man's child, then he could get her out of his life for good. Doctor, Isaac began slowly, maybe you should run a test on her first. Isaac said sharply, his voice edged with ice as he cast a pointed look at Clara. His father, however, appeared almost giddy, a rare smile plastered on his face like a child who'd been promised a long-awaited toy. It was no secret that he had always dreamed of having a grandchild to carry on the Lancaster name, but this time the excitement may have arrived too soon, and the foundation of that joy was built on shaky ground. What are you saying, doctor? Clara began, her voice trembling. I have never, she caught herself mid-sentence, but it was too late. Isaac had already seen the flicker of hesitation, the small crack in her composure. He smirked internally. To him, it was the confirmation he needed. She was hiding something, and he intended to drag it into the light. The doctor, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room, continued professionally. Have you had your period this month? Clara paused, then slowly shook her head. No, not yet. I'll take a blood sample, the doctor said, prepping his syringe. You'll have the results by tomorrow. Clara tensed as the needle slid into her skin. Her thoughts swirled chaotically. Her menstrual cycle had never been predictable. Something her previous doctor had told her was relatively normal, often stress, and Clara had been living under a mountain of stress. The nausea, fatigue, dizziness. It could all be attributed to exhaustion. Couldn't it? She bit her lip, her mind racing. The idea of being pregnant was laughable, tragic even. Isaac had never touched her, not once. In fact, he'd gone out of his way to make sure she stayed at arm's length. He had even said on more than one occasion that he'd rather die than lay a finger on her. No, there was no chance the child could be his. But then, a terrible thought slithered into her mind. What if it was Fred? Fred, the ex-boyfriend from years ago. The man who almost stole her innocence in a dark and suffocating room, only to be interrupted by a stranger who had swooped in at the last moment to save her. She never saw that man's face. The room had been too dark, but she remembered his build, his scent, the way he carried her like she weighed nothing. Now that she thought about it, that scent, it was the same one she had smelled on Isaac's shirt when he lifted her from the kitchen floor. It clung to him. The familiarity of it had nagged at her then, and now it screamed in her mind. Could Isaac have been the stranger from that night? At the same time, Isaac was also wrestling with memories he had tried to bury. In a flashback, he saw himself behind the wheel on a quiet country road, humming along to the radio. He was late for dinner with his best friend Alan, whom he'd forgotten to pick up. As he prepared to turn back, he saw something that made him slam on the brakes. A man, massive and aggressive, was dragging a girl toward a decrepit shack by the roadside. She was screaming, resisting, calling for help. Isaac wasn't the heroic type. He didn't go looking for trouble. But something about the scene ignited something in him. He parked the car, followed the trail, and peeked through a dirty window. The attacker was already looming over the girl. Without thinking, Isaac charged in and grabbed the closest object, a table lamp, slamming it over the man's head. He then scooped the unconscious girl into his arms. She felt delicate, trembling in shock. He thought about how defenseless she had been and swore to himself that if he ever had a daughter, he'd make sure she knew how to defend herself. After dropping the girl off at the nearest hospital, Isaac had driven away, only to be hit head-on by a speeding vehicle just minutes later. That accident had plunged him into years of unconsciousness. Everyone said it was a drunk driver. Isaac had never believed that. It had been too precise, too well-timed. Back in the present, Clara's mind refused to settle. The doctor said she was pregnant, but she didn't believe it, not really. And yet, she couldn't deny how bad she felt. The dizziness, the constant fever, the nausea. It was getting worse. She tried to sleep, but her body was restless. She remembered something her grandmother used to tell her when sleep wouldn't come. Focus on your breathing. Count backward from 100 and imagine the waves washing your worries away. Clara tried it, closing her eyes. A gentle creak of the door broke the silence. Clara opened her eyes slowly to find Madame Josephine standing beside her, holding a small paper bag. "I got you some pain relievers," the older woman said gently. "For the fever and the aches." Clara took the pill with gratitude, her fingers trembling as she reached for the water glass. Just as she brought it to her lips, a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. She recoiled, nearly spilling the glass. "Are you okay?" Madame Josephine asked with concern. "It's nothing," Clara murmured, "just stomach discomfort." Josephine didn't look convinced. "Have you had your period this month?" Clara blinked at the unexpected question, then shook her head. "No, not yet." A slow smile spread across Josephine's face. "Madam, are you pregnant?" Clara sputtered in surprise, the water in her mouth spraying onto the bed. "No, I don't think so. I'm just feeling off." Josephine dabbed at the mess with a napkin and gave Clara a knowing look. "The symptoms you're describing, they're classic signs of pregnancy," Clara apologized, embarrassed. "Please, can I have another pill?" Josephine handed it over. Clara swallowed it quickly and leaned back against the headboard. Exhausted, she drifted into a light sleep. An hour later, Clara stirred to find Josephine watching her. Has she been there the whole time? At the foot of the bed lay a neatly wrapped package. "What's that?" Clara asked, pointing. "I thought you might need it. Don't forget to use it," Josephine said, handing her the package and heading for the door. Clara's curiosity spiked as she opened the box. Inside was a home pregnancy test. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp with confusion. Before Josephine could answer, a knock sounded at the door. "Is the young madam in? I'm here to see her." Clara's stomach turned at the sound of the voice. "Kennedy, yes," she called out weakly, hoping her discomfort would hide the tension in her tone. Josephine opened the door and stepped aside to allow Kennedy in. "Good morning, sister-in-law," he said cheerfully, his eyes gleaming with mischief. Clara offered a weak, polite smile. "Good morning." Josephine sensed the tension and excused herself, muttering something about getting soup for Clara's upset stomach. As soon as she was gone, Kennedy's eyes darted to the test kit. "I didn't know my brother had gotten around to tasting you," he said smugly. Clara bristled. "Do I owe you an explanation about my marriage?" Kennedy chuckled darkly. "I still don't see what you see in my boring brother. He's probably out romancing one of his many lovers while you lie here pregnant and miserable." "Don't you dare speak about Isaac that way," Clara snapped. Despite the pain in her body, she sat up as straight as she could. If she had the strength, she would have slapped him. "Leave my room, now." Kennedy laughed. "And what authority do you have to order me out?" "She has every right," a voice boomed from behind him. Both Clara and Kennedy turned to see Isaac standing in the doorway, his expression like stone. "I came to check on my sister-in-law. Heard she's unwell," Kennedy muttered, clearing his throat. Isaac's eyes were hard. "Are you done visiting?" "I was just leaving," Kennedy said, flashing a false smile. He glanced at his phone. "Urgent meeting." Isaac didn't reply, only lowered a glass of water beside Clara's bed, his eyes never leaving his brother. The tension was cut short as a maid entered the dining room, later to report to Isaac. "Young master, the doctor is here." Hours earlier, Clara had dragged herself out of bed, her body weak and unsteady. Her mouth was parched, her fever high. As she reached for the water glass, another wave of nausea hit her like a tidal wave. Even as her body convulsed with another wave of nausea, Clara knew there was nothing left in her stomach to give. Her insides had been emptied by the relentless sickness, and she hadn't eaten in hours. The thought of food made her feel worse. Since the day Isaac had awakened from his coma, her life had spiraled into chaos. She had convinced herself that the fatigue, the vomiting, the weakness, all of it, was due to the physical and emotional strain he had placed on her. But now, she wasn't so sure. As she sat upright in her bed, the package that Madame Josephine had brought earlier caught her eye again. The edges of the test kit peeked out, daring her to confront the truth. Slowly, reluctantly, she reached for it. There was no harm in taking the test, she told herself. The kit was already there, and it was better to know than keep wondering. Inside the bathroom, her heart pounded like a war drum. She stared down at the pregnancy test as the color shifted on the strip. A gasp escaped her lips. No, this can't be," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. She read the result again, praying she had made a mistake, but the lines were clear. Pregnant. Her hand trembled. The thought struck her like a hammer. This test must be faulty, cheap, inaccurate. There was no other explanation. In a panic, she flushed the evidence down the toilet and paced the bathroom floor, formulating the lie she would tell Madame Josephine when she inevitably asked about the result. Clara pulled out her phone and quickly dialed the number the doctor had left her the previous day. After a few rings, his cheerful voice answered. "Madam, you called just in time for the good news," he said warmly. "As I suspected, you are 3 months pregnant." Clara froze. 3 months? Her lips moved, but no sound came. Finally, she forced herself to speak. "Oh, my husband will be thrilled to hear this," she lied, her tone forced and hollow. "But doctor, please, don't tell anyone yet. I want it to be a surprise." The doctor hesitated. "But your husband asked me for the result. I was actually planning to meet him today with the report." "Please," she begged. "I'll tell him myself, I promise, just not yet." The doctor had known Isaac for years. He was well aware of the man's temper and cruelty. He'd seen it firsthand. The idea of lying to him was terrifying. But Clara, perhaps sensing his hesitation, added, "I'll make sure he doesn't get angry with you, I swear. Just give me a little time." There was silence, followed by a deep sigh. "If you're sure, I'll help you." Clara exhaled in relief. For now the secret was safe. Later that day, Madame Josephine entered the dimly lit room where she and Clara had secretly arranged for her to sleep. They had told Isaac's father a carefully crafted lie. Something about how the master's bedroom was too overwhelming for her in her condition. In truth, Clara had been banished there by her own husband. Seeing Clara still lying down, Josephine approached gently. "You, madam, I brought some soup. It should help with the nausea." Clara sat up slowly. "Why hasn't he taken me to the hospital?" she murmured, pain in her voice. "It's like he doesn't care at all." "I don't want to eat, Madame Josephine. I just want to visit the hospital." The older woman paused. "I overheard the young master talking to someone in the living room. I think it was the family doctor." Clara's stomach flipped. Her fingers gripped the bedpost for support. If the doctor betrayed her, everything would fall apart. Meanwhile, in the main house, Isaac was already shaking hands with the doctor. "I was about to call you," he said. "That makes 2 of us," the doctor replied with a polite smile. "I have many patients to see today, so I won't stay long." He handed over a sealed white envelope. "Here's the result." Isaac's lips curled into a smug smile. At last he had the leverage to remove Clara from his life without opposition from his father. But just as he was about to open the envelope, a servant entered the room. "Sir, your father requests you in the study." Isaac nodded and tucked the envelope into his back pocket before making his way to the familiar room where his father always delivered serious conversations. "Have a seat, John," his father said, waving toward the armchair. "I've been thinking, since your wife is now pregnant, wouldn't it be a good idea for you two to take a vacation?" Isaac blinked. "Dad, How are you so sure she's pregnant? He slowly pulled the envelope from his pocket, opened it, and scanned the contents. His eyes froze on a line printed in bold, negative. "What?" he mouthed unconsciously. His voice came out louder than he intended. "How come?" His father, confused by the reaction, looked over. "What's the matter? She's not pregnant," Isaac said bitterly, tossing the test result onto the desk. His father picked it up and studied it, then looked up with a puzzled expression. "But I thought you didn't want a child. Why do you seem so disappointed?" Isaac bit his tongue. He couldn't reveal his true intentions, not now. So he forced a shrug and muttered, "You're right. It's probably for the best." His father gave him a comforting pat on the shoulder. "Don't worry, son. I'm sure it will happen soon." Isaac gave a stiff nod, his mind already working on a new plan. Since he couldn't divorce her yet, not with his father watching so closely, he would agree to the vacation. Once they were alone, he'd find a way to make her leave him willingly. He would even pay her off if necessary. She came from a money-hungry family, and he had no doubt she would accept the right offer. His thoughts were interrupted by a tap on his shoulder. He turned around and was greeted by the warm, amused eyes of his mother. "You didn't tell me you were visiting," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I didn't know I needed permission to visit my own house," she teased. He laughed. "Of course not. I just wasn't expecting you." She twirled dramatically in her designer gown. "Your future wife will need lessons from me on how to keep her style." Isaac chuckled, then froze as she abruptly asked, "What about Jane?" He scoffed. "She's Dad's wife now." Meanwhile, in the maid's quarters, Clara sat deep in thought, her mind drifting to her younger brother Liam, who remained in the hospital. She hadn't seen him since her last visit, and her anxiety was building again. If Isaac found out about her pregnancy, he might force a divorce. And, if that happened, her plan to sell her remaining business shares to help pay for Liam's treatment would collapse. "Madame," she whispered, "do you know when the young master will leave the house?" Madame Josephine glanced toward the hallway. "Soon. His driver is already waiting." Relief flooded Clara's chest. "Can I trust you to cover for me while I visit the hospital?" "I'll cover for you, young madam," Josephine promised without hesitation. Emotion overwhelmed Clara. "When I become wealthy, I promise to take you away from here," she whispered. It was an innocent promise, perhaps foolish, but deeply heartfelt. Once Isaac's car disappeared down the driveway, Clara and Josephine quietly approached the gate. "Where are you two going?" the guard asked, eyeing them suspiciously. "To get groceries," Josephine replied with practiced ease. She was known to the guards and trusted. Clara, with her scarf pulled up to hide her features, passed as her younger sister. Once they were safely outside, Clara ordered a ride and they waited. At the hospital, the doctor reviewed Liam's report and called Clara into his office. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside. "I have bad news," he began. Clara clenched her fists. "What is it?" "Well, I might be able to help if you're willing to cooperate," he said, his eyes trailing her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "What do you mean?" she asked, stepping back. "Come now, Clara. You know I've always cared for you." Her blood boiled. This wasn't compassion, it was exploitation. Without thinking, she grabbed the glass of water from his desk and hurled it into his face. "Go to hell," she spat, storming out of the office just as Madame Josephine was walking down the corridor to meet her. The sharp voice startled Clara as she turned toward the door. There stood Isaac, his face set in stone, eyes burning with disapproval. He didn't even bother with a proper greeting. "Don't you have a thing for harassing every man you meet?" he snapped coldly. Clara's mouth fell open in disbelief. Harassing? She had just stormed out of the hospital office after dousing that awful doctor with water for trying to manipulate her. Now Isaac was accusing her of being the problem? She opened her mouth to defend herself, but he silenced her with a raised hand. "Better have a good reason for leaving the house without my permission," he said before turning and knocking on the very door she had just come from. Panic flared in Clara's chest. What had she gotten herself into? Her heart raced as she rushed down the hallway, entering her brother Liam's ward. There he lay, frail and shirtless, the hospital light casting shadows across his pale skin. But despite his condition, his face lit up the moment she entered. A soft smile spread across his lips as he opened his eyes. "You finally came," Liam whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Why haven't you visited since the last time? Clara blinked away the guilt. How could she tell him she was sick, pregnant, and still hiding it from everyone? That her life had turned into a mess of lies and secrets? That Isaac had made her existence a miserable cycle of fear and survival? No, she couldn't burden him with any of that. Instead, she offered a lie that might comfort him. "I was raising money for your surgeries," she whispered back, stroking his arm gently. Back outside, Isaac was livid. He had made it clear to the entire household. Clara was not to step foot out of the mansion without his explicit permission, and now here she was, wandering the city on her own. He turned toward his chief of security, who stood with his head bowed in guilt. "I want a full report on who allowed her to leave." "By tomorrow," Isaac said icily before walking off. Clara caught up with him just as he was about to get into the car. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "I'm sorry for leaving without your permission." He had been preparing to unleash fury on her, to scold her into tears, but something shifted inside him as he looked at her. She was thinner, paler. Her eyes were tired, her frame more fragile than ever. For a moment, just a moment, he felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. "What were you doing at the hospital?" he asked finally. "I went to see my sick brother." The silence between them stretched. Clara clutched her fingers together, nervous but determined. If he was going to punish her, then so be it. But before he could, she took a deep breath and said what had been on her mind for days. "I want a divorce." Isaac froze, his head tilted slightly, as if he wasn't sure he heard her correctly. "You want a divorce?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I know I'm not good enough to be your wife. Maybe now you can marry someone who fits your standard." His lips twitched. Not with anger. No, this was amusement. "I'm glad you finally understood your place in my life," he said, smirking. "I must admit, you're bold. Asking me for a divorce takes guts." His words stung more than she expected, but she didn't let it show. Aside from her incredible cooking skills, which he secretly craved every day, she was an enigma to him, equal parts infuriating and fascinating. Since she'd started making his meals, no other food seemed to satisfy him. Still, he continued to belittle her at every chance. "I'll grant you your divorce," he said, "when my father returns." "But Madame Josephine said he's gone on another business trip. He won't be back until next month." "Yes," Isaac nodded. "That's right," panic crept into Clara's voice. "Next month might be too late. I'd prefer if we filed the divorce paperwork with the court first. We can explain it to your father later." Isaac was thrown by her insistence. It wasn't like her to be this assertive. She had always seemed hesitant, submissive. What had changed? Why was she so desperate to leave? "Why should I agree to that?" he barked. "How dare you try to negotiate with me? Weren't you forced into this marriage? Isn't this what you always wanted?" Back in her room, Clara lay restless, the weight of her secret pushing down on her chest like a boulder. It wasn't even night yet, but her body begged for rest. Her limbs ached, her head throbbed, and her thoughts were tangled. The door creaked open, and Madame Josephine entered with a warm plate of food. "Madame, you're back so soon," Clara said weakly. "I had some medication prescribed," she replied, pointing to a small pack beside her on the bed. "The doctor says it's just a cold." Madame Josephine exhaled with relief. "Thank goodness. I thought it was something worse." Clara wanted to believe it too, but she knew the truth. It wasn't a cold, it was a child, and soon her secret would be impossible to hide. Across the house, Isaac sat brooding. He couldn't shake the suspicion. Clara had proposed divorce. She never would have done that before. What was she hiding? He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "I want you to monitor my wife," he instructed. "Report everything." Back in the bedroom, Madame Josephine offered Clara a strip of dried meat. Clara's stomach churned. "No thank you," she said quickly, another wave of nausea rushing in. "I think it's the medication." Josephine nodded slowly. "I just worry. You don't seem well at all." Later that night, Clara picked up an old book her grandmother had given her years ago, a thick, time-worn volume on traditional healing. She flipped through the pages until she found one about pregnancy symptoms. As she read, her mind wandered to the past, to holidays spent with her grandmother, a medicine woman renowned in her village. Though Clara had never taken an interest in the craft back then, she remembered the elder's words, "If you learn even a little of my work, it will serve you one day." Now, perhaps, was that day. One technique caught her eye. Carefully, she retrieved a thin needle and prepared to follow the instructions when she had barely pierced the skin when the door burst open. "Madam." "What are you doing?" Josephine cried out, startled. Clara dropped the needle. "It's nothing, just a traditional method to ease stomach discomfort," Clara said quickly. Josephine's worry faded, replaced with surprise. "You know about that method?" Clara forced a smile. "Learned it from my grandmother." She discreetly slid the book under her blanket, shielding the title from Josephine's view. After a few minutes, Clara genuinely felt better. Her stomach settled, and a surprising hunger crept in. "I think I'm hungry," she said brightly. Josephine beamed. "Finally!" She hurried off before Clara could change her mind. Moments later, she returned with a plate of cake and a glass of juice. Clara took a cautious bite. Surprisingly, it stayed down. The flavors even brought comfort. "My manners," she joked mid-chew. "I usually don't eat this noisily," Josephine chuckled. "Eat however you like. I'm just happy to see you eat at all." The room grew quiet again, filled only with the gentle sounds of chewing and peace. "Madam, do you have a family?" Clara asked softly. "Yes. A husband and a teenage son." Clara's eyes sparkled. "How was his delivery? Was it difficult?" Josephine's face lit up with joy. "He was the best thing that ever happened to me. I didn't even realize I was pregnant at first. I thought I just had the flu." Clara listened intently, calculating. By the time Isaac's father returned from his trip, she would be over 3 months along. She couldn't wait that long. She had to leave, soon. The next day, Isaac brought Clara along to his physiotherapy appointment, a decision made under the guise of controlling her movements. As the session ended, he looked around and frowned. Where had she gone? Just a moment ago, she had been right there, watching him. Then the door creaked open, and there she stood. Her eyes flickered over him, particularly to his bare chest, and she looked away quickly. "Where did you go?" he snapped. I was in the restroom," she said, eyes avoiding his gaze. He caught her looking at him, and his voice sharpened. "What are you staring at?" Her face turned crimson. "Nothing," she murmured, lowering her head. "I want my shoes back." She rushed forward to help, but her trembling hands betrayed her. He noticed instantly. "What's the delay? Can't even manage to buckle my shoes properly?" he barked. I'm struggling with it, sir," Clara stammered, her hands shaking as she tried to fasten Nathaniel's shoes. With a scoff of frustration, he shoved her aside. "I should have known you were useless," he snapped, kneeling down to finish the task himself. Clara had barely stepped back when a loud thud echoed across the room. Startled, she turned just in time to see him sprawled on the floor, face down, his knee twisted beneath him in a painful angle. The scene, as strange as it was, struck her with a conflicting mix of amusement. She bit her lip hard, silencing the chuckle that threatened to escape. Laughing could very well be a death sentence in this house. Yet despite her instincts screaming at her to stay back, she rushed to his side, reaching out to help. She remembered how furious he'd been moments earlier, simply because she couldn't buckle a pair of shoes properly. The man before her, the one she was supposed to call her husband, was as unpredictable as a storm at sea. Nathaniel lay still for a moment, swallowing his pride. His ego stung more than the pain in his knee. And there she was again, hovering, pretending to care. It disgusted him, but he couldn't look away. "Well," he gritted, "are you going to help me, or will you just stand there like you did earlier?" Before she could answer, he suddenly lunged forward, gripping her by the throat. Her eyes widened in shock as her hands instinctively flew to his arms, trying to free herself. Air fled her lungs as panic set in, her nails digging into his wrists. Let me go," she gasped, her voice barely audible. His grip tightened before, without warning, he released her. She collapsed to the floor with a hard thud, landing on her backside, coughing and gasping for air as the burn in her lungs faded slowly. "That makes the two of us," he sneered, brushing imaginary dust off his sleeves. "And if you ever do something like this again, I'll have you thrown into the streets, where you belong." His words rang in her ears long after he'd turned away. Had he forgotten she was the one who had asked for the divorce? Or was this all some cruel performance to show her who really held the power? But Clara was done playing his games. If provoking him was the only way to push him toward signing the divorce papers, then she would do it, as many times as it took. Her appointment with Mr. Langston, her late mother's former business partner, was just around the corner. He was the only person interested in purchasing her remaining shares of the family business. If she could close the deal quickly, she would finally have the funds to pay for Liam's surgery. Every second counted. Just then, footsteps echoed down the hallway. It was Kenneth, Nathaniel's younger brother, arrogant, conniving, and far too smug for his own good. "Hey, brother, sister-in-law," he drawled, entering the room with the same smirk he always wore. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything." Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" Kenneth's gaze slid over Clara like oil, clearly noticing the disheveled state she was in, but he wisely chose not to comment. "I came to drop these off," he said, holding out a bundle of documents. "Mr. Langston sent these for you to sign." As soon as Clara heard the name, her heart sank. Nathaniel snatched the papers and skimmed through them, his lips twisted into a cold smile. "So, this is why you're so eager for a divorce," he muttered. "Trying to cash out before running away, huh?" Without another word, he handed the papers to Kenneth. "Tell my wife to come see me." Clara had just stepped outside for air, trying to calm her spiraling thoughts. She pressed her hand gently to her belly. Her heart whispered to the tiny life growing within. Whatever its origins, it was hers, and she would protect it with every breath. "Mrs. E?" A voice broke through her thoughts. Startled, she turned to find Kenneth again, his gaze lingering a little too long. "What do you want now?" she asked, weary of him. "Is it a crime to check on my beautiful sister-in-law?" he teased. "If your brother sees you, he'll feed you your teeth," she snapped. Kenneth chuckled darkly. "Looks like I'm not the one in danger right now. Your dear husband wants to see you." The weight of dread returned instantly. Clara walked back into the room with stiff legs and a pounding heart. Nathaniel stood with the documents now strewn across the floor. "This why you wanted out so badly?" he shouted. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told him yet. How did he get the paperwork? How did you get those? You still have the nerve to ask me questions? He barked, stepping forward. "Did you think I wouldn't find out about your little meeting with Langston? I wasn't doing anything wrong. I needed the money to—" His hand lashed out, striking her across the face. She staggered, biting back tears. "Don't insult my intelligence," he growled. "You planned to run away with another man, didn't you? Well, I've got news for you. Every cent he pays is going into my account, and if you want a divorce, you'll pay back every dime my family spent on you and your pathetic family." Clara could hardly believe the venom in his voice. "I didn't get any of the money your father gave my family," she whispered. "They kept it all. I never saw a single coin." "Then get them to pay it back," he snapped. With tears stinging her eyes, she turned and fled the room. She had already signed her portion of the business transfer. That share now belonged to Langston, and any claim Nathaniel had was null. Her phone buzzed. The message was short. "Meet me at Sable Lounge." Her hands trembled. Could she go through with this? Inside, Nathaniel watched her leave with an expression of grim satisfaction. She hated him. He knew that now. But she wasn't going anywhere. He wouldn't give her the divorce. Ever. A knock pulled him from his dark thoughts. "Sir, your mother is here." In the living room, his mother beamed as he approached. "You don't look well at all," she observed. "Is your wife not taking care of you?" "I'm fine, mother," he muttered, brushing off her hand. "Where is she?" He snapped his fingers at a nearby servant. "Fetch Clara." Clara nearly forgot the woman's presence in their lives. She descended the stairs slowly, still shaken. "Good evening, mother-in-law," she said with a forced smile. "Why do you look like this? So unkempt and pale," the woman said, tone unreadable. "I'm okay, just—" "That's not why I'm here," she interrupted. "I want to know if you're treating my son right. He is the reason your wretched family has had any luck at all." Clara turned to Nathaniel, hoping for a lifeline, but his expression was blank. "I'll be heading to my appointment," he said, walking away. His mother narrowed her eyes. "Go with him, or have you forgotten your place?" "No, ma'am," Clara replied, following slowly. She knocked on the bathroom door where he was supposed to be changing for a swim. "Come in," he said. She opened the door. There he was, in the bathtub, sipping wine as though nothing in the world could trouble him. She averted her gaze quickly. "I thought you'd be getting ready for the pool. I decided on this instead," he said. "Now come here, I need my feet massaged." She hesitated. Now, reluctantly, she knelt beside the tub, hands trembling as they found his foot. She massaged as gently as she could, trying to avoid looking at his body in the water. "And now my waist," he ordered. She froze. "What?" "You heard me." Her hand slid under the water hesitantly. Just as she reached his waist, she accidentally brushed against something else. Before she could pull away, his hand shot out and gripped her throat, dragging her into the tub with a splash. "I knew it," he hissed. "You just wanted an excuse to touch me." Her scream was swallowed by the water as he held her under. "You really are something else," Nathaniel sneered, thrusting Clara roughly out of the bathtub with a disgusted glare. He knew she wouldn't retaliate, not after what he had just done to her, not after the look of terror that had painted her face moments before. And yet, as much as he wanted to keep telling himself that she deserved it, that she had been toying with him, there was something about her expression, something utterly convincing in her shocked reaction, that told him she hadn't expected her hand to brush him there. Still, that scent, her scent, lingered. The same one from the night so long ago. The night he had thrown himself between a helpless girl and her attacker. The night a truck hit him and stole years of his life. Now here she was, and that scent had returned like a ghost from his past, bringing confusion and conflict in its wake. Clara, trembling from head to toe, bolted from the bathroom. Her vision was blurry with unshed tears, her body soaked and heavy. She could feel her humiliation trailing behind her like a shadow. Back in the safety of her quarters, Madame Joan's worried gaze locked onto her. "Madame, what happened to you?" Joan asked gently, noticing her soaked clothes and pale face. "Nothing," Clara mumbled hastily and slipped into the bathroom to change. She scrubbed the shame from her skin, but no amount of hot water or soap could erase what had just occurred. She dried herself quickly, changed into fresh clothes, and made her way into the kitchen. She needed a distraction, something to occupy her racing thoughts. Anything but Nathaniel. But the peace didn't last. The kitchen door burst open with a loud bang, and Nathaniel stood there like a storm in human form. In his hand he held a crumpled medical report. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight with rage. He threw the document at her with venom in his voice. "So this is why you were so desperate for a divorce," he roared. "You disgusting little thing, how dare you!" Clara stood frozen, utterly bewildered. "What? What are you talking about? Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" he continued, his voice booming through the room. "You're pregnant, Clara, pregnant, and now you're going to tell me who the father is." Before she could utter a word, he was beside her in 2 strides. His hand came down hard across her face, the impact so fierce it left her stumbling back, cheeks blazing with pain. "You're not just a gold digger," he growled. "You're a whore." Tears streamed down Clara's face as fear coiled tight in her chest. Her knees weakened. I don't know who the father is," she whispered, trembling. Nathaniel's fury surged. "I won't ask again. If you don't answer me right now, you'll be responsible for everything that happens next. Now tell me, who is responsible for this pregnancy?" Clara couldn't stop the shaking in her limbs. I haven't been with anyone since I came into this house," I've never even," she couldn't finish. Her voice died under the weight of fear and shame. But she wasn't lying. She had never been with any man, not truly. Her memories were a fog of trauma and confusion, and even her own mind refused to give her clarity. "You really expect me to believe that?" Nathaniel snarled. He lunged again, his hand wrapping around her throat with a grip like steel. Clara gasped, her hands clawing at his arm as he squeezed tighter. Her vision blurred, panic set in. "Tell me," he demanded through clenched teeth. I'll tell you," she choked out. "Please, just let go." He paused, his grip loosening slightly as he waited. "It's Ken's, isn't it?" he spat. She shook her head, unable to speak. More tears welled in her eyes. The accusation felt like a dagger. "Then who?" he roared. "I don't know," she sobbed. Finally, he let her go. Clara collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as air rushed painfully back into her lungs. Her hands pressed to her chest as her body shuddered. "I'll find out myself," he growled, storming to the door. "Let's see what your precious Ken has to say." Moments later, Kenneth arrived, cheerful and oblivious. "Bro, you wanted to see me?" Nathaniel didn't waste time. He handed him the report, with the same fire burning in his eyes. Ken unfolded the paper and froze. "Wait, this is... Clara's pregnant?" he stammered. Nathaniel's hand flew across Ken's face, the slap echoing like a gunshot. "What the hell, man?" Ken cried, holding his face. "Are you the father?" Nathaniel barked. "What? No, I swear, I've never touched her." Another slap, harder this time. Ken stumbled backward, his eyes wide with fear. "Brother, please! I wouldn't. If it's not yours, then whose is it?" Ken shook his head, bewildered. "Isn't it yours?" Nathaniel's lips curled in disgust. "Shut up!" Ken's mind spun. Did she cheat on you while living in this house?" Nathaniel didn't respond. He simply walked away, leaving the room thick with tension. Ken turned to Clara, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "Well, I guess the truth is out," he mocked. "I should have known you'd try to pin this on me." Clara stayed silent, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Ken reached out to grab her, furious at her indifference. But a voice boomed from the hallway. "Let her go, now." Mr. Ellis, Nathaniel's father, stood in the doorway with a gaze so sharp it could cut steel. His presence froze the air in the room. "How dare you lay your filthy hands on her?" he shouted, marching toward Clara. She looked up, stunned to see the patriarch of the house rushing to her defense. Ken, ever the coward, tried to retreat, but 2 guards grabbed him and shoved him to the floor before Mr. Ellis. "Take him away, and punish him properly," Mr. Ellis ordered. "And as for Nathaniel, he better have a damn good explanation for what I'm hearing." Just then, Nathaniel appeared, now dressed in simpler clothes but reeking of alcohol. His eyes met his father's, confused and wary. "What did you hear?" he asked. Mr. Ellis didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and slapped his son across the face. "I told you I would punish anyone who harmed her," he said coldly. Nathaniel's world spun. His father had never struck him before. "You're siding with her?" "You're lucky that's all I've done," Mr. Ellis muttered, guiding Clara to the sitting room and gesturing for Nathaniel to follow. "Sit, we're going to talk." Nathaniel reluctantly obeyed, but sat as far from Clara as he could. "I came back early when I heard about her pregnancy," Mr. Ellis began. "I knew you'd react poorly, so I came to stop you from doing something stupid." Nathaniel scowled. Love? He'd never love someone like Clara, not in this lifetime or the next. "I know how you've treated her. I know you've made her do chores like a maid in a house full of servants." "She is worse than a maid," Nathaniel spat. His father silenced him with a glare so cold it burned. "If you say another word against her, you'll regret it." Before Nathaniel could respond, Clara suddenly cried out in pain, clutching her abdomen. Mr. Ellis leapt to his feet, shouting for help. Guards rushed in. Clara was taken to the hospital, the same one where her brother Liam was staying. After a quick examination, the doctor confirmed it was nothing serious. "She and the baby are fine," he said. "She just needs rest." Back at the estate, Mr. Ellis ordered Clara to be moved into the master bedroom. Nathaniel hated the idea. He hated her presence, her eyes, her scent. But he said nothing. That night she lay at the far edge of the bed, wrapped in her pink nightgown. She pretended to sleep, though her body refused to rest. When the door finally opened and Nathaniel entered, she didn't move. She didn't know what would happen next. Nathaniel waited until the room fell into complete silence, a stillness broken only by the faint hum of the table lamp near the bed. He could tell she had turned off the main lights and dimmed the room in a deliberate attempt to fall asleep, or at least appear to. From where he stood at the doorway, he studied her form lying on the bed, motionless. Was she asleep, or simply pretending? A soft whimper escaped from her side of the bed. He paused, frowning, unsure whether it had been a dream-induced sound or a muffled cry. When it came again, this time slightly clearer, curiosity pushed him forward. Despite his earlier vows to never touch her again, something in that small sound pulled at him. He walked to her side and gently reached out. The moment his hand made contact with her arm, Clara jolted awake, panic flooding her eyes. She thrashed instinctively, and he had to reach quickly to hold her, preventing her from tumbling off the bed. Their sudden closeness caught them both off guard. Her hand gripped his neck, her other instinctively clutching at his waist, and then she didn't move. Her breathing steadied, and to his surprise, she remained in that position. Within seconds, she had relaxed entirely against him, her head coming to rest in the crook of his shoulder as though it had always belonged there. He stared down at her sleeping form, unsure what had just happened. Her soft breathing began to slow into a rhythmic pattern. Then, the faintest sound of a snore tickled his chest. He tried to move, tried to pull away, but she responded by snuggling closer to him, clutching his shirt tighter in her sleep. Her warmth, her scent, familiar and haunting, wrapped around him like a blanket he didn't know he needed. Eventually, he gave up resisting and allowed his body to relax beside hers. And just like that, Nathaniel fell asleep, with Clara curled against him, her breath a gentle lullaby on his chest. By morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed in through the curtains. Clara stirred first, blinking against the light, a rare sensation of peace washing over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel weighed down by exhaustion or fear. But the peace didn't last. As she attempted to sit up, she realized she couldn't move. A strong hand was firmly clasped around her waist, holding her in place. Her heart raced. She pushed gently against the hold, panic rising, until she turned her head and saw him. Nathaniel holding her and sleeping beside her as if they were lovers who had spent the night in bliss rather than two people at war. How was this possible? This was the man who had once refused to even share a room with her, who barely looked at her without disgust, and now his arm was curled around her like it was the most natural thing in the world. She made another attempt to move, and this time, the grip loosened. As she tried to roll away from him, he suddenly pulled her back toward him, his towering figure pinning her beneath him. Her breath caught. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice trembling. His eyes flickered open, gaze sharp and unreadable. "Isn't this what you've always wanted?" he muttered. Before she could comprehend his words, his lips descended on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was firm, possessive, laced with tension and desire. She had once longed for this moment, dreamt of it even, but not like this. Not when he was still so angry and conflicted. She pushed against his chest, but her resistance only made his hold tighten. Realizing he wasn't letting go, Clara stopped struggling. She went still, her body tensed beneath him. For a heartbeat, he remained above her, staring into her wide, uncertain eyes. Then suddenly, as if disgusted by his own actions, Nathaniel pulled away and shoved her roughly. She fell from the bed, landing hard on the floor with a thud. Embarrassed and humiliated, Clara scrambled to her feet and ran to the bathroom. The sting of rejection and confusion burned in her chest. She washed up quickly, but in her haste, she had forgotten to bring a change of clothes. Peeking through a small crack in the bathroom door, she saw the bedroom was empty. She took the opportunity and slipped out to grab a fresh dress. But just as she reached her dresser, the bedroom door swung open. Nathaniel stood there, his expression unreadable, yet clearly disturbed. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply. Was he implying she had planned to seduce him? She didn't reply. He brushed past her, ignoring her presence, and walked into his study, slamming the door shut behind him. But alone in his study, he couldn't shake her from his mind. He tried focusing on his files, but her scent lingered, her lips burned into his memory. He had been with many women, flings, flirts, lovers, but none had made his blood simmer quite like Clara. A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he muttered, expecting a servant, but it was Clara. Her dress hung loosely, the zipper undone. She entered hesitantly and softly asked, "Can you help me with this?" He should have told her no. He should have ignored her, but instead he stood and walked toward her. As his fingers zipped up the back of her dress, they brushed against the smooth skin of her back. He inhaled sharply, momentarily forgetting himself. She thanked him and mentioned that breakfast was ready downstairs, then turned and left down at the breakfast table. Nathaniel's father, Mr. Everett, sat waiting, his demeanor unusually calm. Clara sat beside the seat meant for Nathaniel, clearly placed there under Mr. Everett's instructions. As Nathaniel entered, he caught sight of her lips, slightly swollen, likely from the kiss. It made his stomach churn, not out of guilt, but something else entirely. He greeted his father with a forced smile and sat down. Kenneth was already at the table, looking bruised and worn, silently eating. Nathaniel barely acknowledged him. Everyone turned to him, startled. "What I'm about to say," might come as a surprise," he continued. "But I want you to know the child Clara is carrying, it's yours, Nathaniel." Shock painted every face at the table. Nathaniel stared blankly, not comprehending. "The night we brought Clara home, I feared you wouldn't survive, so I had one of the best doctors sedate her and use your sperm to inseminate her," Mr. Everett explained. Clara's eyes widened in disbelief, her hands flying to her lips as she began to sob. All this time she had endured Nathaniel's abuse, convinced he hated her for betraying him, when she hadn't betrayed anyone at all. Mr. Everett moved to her side and pulled her into a gentle embrace. "It's all right, Clara. No one will mistreat you ever again." Nathaniel could take no more. Rage flared inside him. He slammed his fists onto the table and stormed out of the dining room, leaving behind a stunned silence. She attempted to push him away, but his strength easily overpowered hers. His broad figure loomed above her, leaving her with little room to resist. At first, Clara stiffened under his touch, hoping he would release her as he had during their last encounter. But this time, instead of pushing her away in anger, Nathaniel leaned in, his mouth brushing against the delicate skin of her neck. He began with the faintest of nibbles, tentative at first, then slowly more lingering, igniting a feverish sensation deep within her. A soft gasp escaped her lips as her body betrayed her confusion and gave into the warmth he stirred. She brought her hands to the back of his neck, and in a moment of impulsive daring, she straddled him, her lips close to his ear, her breath mingling with his. Nathaniel moaned softly, a sound she had never heard from him before, and then, to her dismay, he gently pulled away. The spell broke. His body retreated, his heat replaced with the chill of silence. Clara sat still, stunned. What had just happened? Had she done something wrong? Had her response repelled him instead of drawing him closer? He didn't speak, didn't look back. With a practiced nonchalance, Nathaniel fastened their seatbelts, turned the ignition, and the car roared to life. The drive home was marked by an oppressive silence. He couldn't explain what had come over him in the car. If he hadn't restrained himself, he might have taken her right there in the back seat, consequences be damned. It disturbed him how easily she unsettled him, how much control she had over his restraint, over his emotion. When they finally arrived at the estate, Nathaniel exited the vehicle without a word. Clara waited a few beats before stepping out herself. She feared that her presence alone might spark his anger again. With quiet footsteps, she turned away and made her way to Madame Eloise's room. She knocked gently, and the elderly woman opened the door, concern immediately clouding her expression. "Young Miss Clara, are you all right? Did you quarrel with the master again?" Madame Eloise asked, ushering her inside. Clara shared everything, her account of what had happened at the gala, his unpredictable behavior, his sudden affection followed by cold retreat. After listening quietly, Madame Eloise gave a knowing smile. "I think the master's heart is already lost to you, my dear. He's only being overprotective of what he secretly cherishes," she said with a soft chuckle. Despite Clara's insistence on spending the night in Madame Eloise's room, the older woman gently urged her to return to her husband. "He may not say it, but he needs you more than he knows," she said before guiding Clara to the hallway. Back in the master bedroom, Nathaniel was sprawled across the bed in nothing but his pajama pants, his muscled chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Clara tiptoed in, slipped into her pink nightwear, and quietly climbed into her side of the bed. No sooner had her back touched the mattress than Nathaniel's eyes opened slowly. "Where did you go?" he asked, his voice thick from sleep. "I went to see Madame Eloise," she answered softly, caught off guard by his sudden awareness. He rolled his eyes. "Go to sleep," he said curtly, turning away. But Clara couldn't sleep. She wasn't even tired. She lay still, pretending to sleep, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, aware of his breathing just inches away. Curiosity soon overtook hesitation, and her hands strayed toward him, tracing his chest lightly. He didn't respond, at first. Then, suddenly, he grabbed her wandering hand and pulled her under him. "Let me show you how it's done," he whispered in a husky tone. His lips found hers, slow and soft at first. When she didn't resist, he deepened the kiss, his hands moving to explore the curve of her body beneath her nightgown. Clara tensed beneath him, unsure whether to fight or surrender. Her breath caught in her throat as he caressed her. Then he paused, pulling back just enough to study her face. "Do you want me to continue?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. A wicked grin crossed his face as he reached for the hem of her gown and began lifting it. Her bare skin glowed softly under the lamp's light. He gasped quietly, taken by the sight of her. She instinctively tried to cover herself, but he gently pulled her hands away. "Don't hide. Let me see you." His hands traced along her body, and Clara moaned softly. But just as the air thickened with unspoken desire, she cried out, "I don't want this." Nathaniel froze. His eyes widened in disbelief. She had just given him permission, so why was she taking it back? He glanced down, frustration obvious in the bulge pressing against his pants. His body ached with unfulfilled need, but he gritted his teeth and pulled away, storming into the bathroom for a cold shower. When he returned, she was already asleep, her back turned toward him. He lay beside her without touching her, his body still trembling with anger and confusion. He cursed himself for letting his emotions rule him, and cursed her for toying with them. Why hadn't she stopped him earlier? The next morning, Nathaniel awoke to find the bed empty. Her absence no longer concerned him. Let her be wherever she wanted. He was done caring. As he moved toward the bathroom, a knock sounded at the door. "Sir, your father requests your presence downstairs," the servant called. He groaned. What now? With reluctance, he threw on a shirt and made his way to the grand staircase, where his father stood, dressed sharply in a tailored brown suit, his face unusually bright. "Son," Mr. Everett greeted. "There's a fundraising event today. I'd like you to accompany me." Nathaniel was about to agree until he heard the next part. "Alongside your wife." A sour taste formed in his mouth. The last time he'd gone anywhere public with Clara had ended in disaster. "Dad, I have meetings at the office. I'm sure your secretary can reschedule." And just like that, the matter was decided. No room for negotiation. Mr. Everett never changed his mind once it was made. Nathaniel left to prepare, irritated but resigned. When he re-entered the dressing room, Clara was already dressed in a soft floral gown that stopped just at her knees. Her hair was down, cascading gently over her shoulders, and her makeup was light but refined. She looked graceful, almost ethereal. "I was wondering where you went," she said as he walked past her, offering only a brief glance before disappearing into the bathroom. She watched the door close behind him. He hadn't said a word about her appearance. Perhaps she had expected too much. At the charity gala, the Everett family arrived like royalty, exuding wealth and influence. Eyes turned immediately to Clara. Her beauty commanded attention, and Nathaniel noticed the way the men looked at her. Some with admiration, others with desire. Without thinking, he offered her his arm and wrapped it around hers possessively. She blinked in surprise. Last time, he had abandoned her to sit alone. This time, he never left her side. Nathaniel carried Clara in his arms, bridal style, all the way to the car. His grip was firm yet tender, her body curled against his chest, fitting as though she had always belonged there. He opened the door and gently laid her down so her head rested on his shoulder as they settled into the back seat. As they drove home through the dim-lit city streets, Clara clung to his arm, her warmth seeping into his skin. She didn't sleep. Instead, she pressed herself closer to him, breathing in sync with him, like she was trying to memorize the rhythm of his heartbeat. Nathaniel stared at the ceiling in silence, his thoughts tangled. What had he gotten himself into? This wasn't who he was. He had always been in control, always aloof and untouchable, a man with a heart so fortified not even his own mother dared to tread too closely. He didn't bend to a woman's will. He didn't cave to emotions, but Clara was changing that. As if hearing the storm in his mind, she turned to him, her hand brushing his cheek. Her touch was feather-light, but it carried weight, a message unspoken. Before he could react, her lips found his in a kiss that was urgent, wild, filled with reckless abandon. He froze. It caught him off guard. What was she doing? Was this just another one of her unpredictable games? He attempted to pull away, but she bit his bottom lip, gently, teasingly, pulling a smirk from him despite himself. Was she mocking him now? Giving him a taste of his own medicine? He should have stopped her. He should have been the one to take control. But just as he was about to speak, her voice, soft and trembling, reached his ears. "Nathaniel, make love to me." That single sentence silenced every rational thought. Was this another trap? Was she using desire to manipulate him as she had in the past? Doubt flickered in his eyes, but then something unexpected happened. As he turned his head away to resist the rising heat within him, a painful tension tugged between his legs, betraying the internal war raging in him. It was more than lust. It was the unbearable pull of something deeper, something unspoken. There were other women, more beautiful, more willing, but none of them made his heart beat like this. None of them had shaken his foundation. And then, as if sensing his hesitation, Clara withdrew. Her fingers released his hand and she rolled away from him, her back facing him, her body stiff with rejection. That moment hit him harder than any accusation. For the first time, he saw her vulnerability, her sincerity. She wasn't playing a game. She was offering herself not just in flesh, but in trust. A pang of emotion sliced through him. He moved closer, his hand brushing along her arm, and when she didn't pull away, he knew her heart was open to him. He leaned in, pressing his lips to her shoulder, whispering, "Are you sure?" Clara turned around and wrapped her arms around his neck, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "I'm sure." Nathaniel inhaled deeply. Her scent. It was so familiar. And then it hit him, like a flash of lightning in the dark. That night, the night he had rescued a young girl from a monstrous man just before his accident, the scent of her hair. It was the same. His heart clenched. "It was you," he whispered, looking into her eyes. "Do you remember that night? The one where you were nearly hurt?" Clara's breath caught. "Yes, I remember. I was the one who saved you," he confessed, pulling her into a tight embrace. Tears welled in her eyes as realization dawned. "You? I'm sorry, Clara, for everything, for all the pain I caused you." She smiled faintly. "I forgave you long ago. Otherwise, I wouldn't have offered you this part of me." Nathaniel was speechless. He hadn't expected forgiveness. He certainly hadn't earned it. And now, holding her, he wanted to be a better man. He got up from the bed momentarily and reached for a small packet from his pocket. Clara let out a tiny protest, but he calmed her with a kiss. When he returned, she looked at him in awe, and despite all she'd endured, she trusted him. What happened next felt less like passion and more like healing. Nathaniel was gentle, worshipful. Clara's body trembled as he undressed her piece by piece, marveling at her beauty, treating every inch of her as if it were sacred. She gasped when his lips touched her skin, and as his hands moved with practiced grace, he found himself wanting to prolong her pleasure rather than rush it. She teased him back with shy remarks, and for the first time he laughed during intimacy, not out of mockery, but joy. They were tangled in each other, moving together in perfect rhythm, her moans soft and melodic in the quiet room. And when he finally took her, he did so with reverence. Later, he carried her to the shower, and they bathed together in comfortable silence. Clara, though initially bashful, couldn't hide her smile. Nathaniel teased her as she tried to cover herself again, joking, "You weren't this shy a few minutes ago." When they returned to bed, she snuggled close to him, sleep overtaking her quickly. Nathaniel lay awake, his arms around her. For the first time, he felt content. Morning came with sunlight filtering through the curtains. Nathaniel stirred and smiled down at her. "Good morning, darling." Clara tried to slip away, wincing slightly. "I'm sore," she whispered. He chuckled, catching her wrist and pulling her back into his arms. "You're not going to starve your husband now, are you?" She giggled, pinched his cheek playfully, and tried to escape again, but he was too fast. He tackled her back into bed, hovering over her. "Nathaniel, please," she murmured. "I'm sore." "You weren't complaining last night," he teased. "It's not good for the baby," she added shyly. "The baby will appreciate the love," he grinned, placing a kiss on her lips. She rolled her eyes, but the smile stayed. Then, softly, their lips met again. Not in desperation this time, but with tenderness. As the kiss deepened, Clara melted into his embrace once more, and with it, the space between them vanished completely. As Clara responded to every kiss, letting herself melt beneath Nathaniel's touch, their intimacy became a silent language, spoken only between them. Then, all of a sudden, Nathaniel broke the kiss, a lopsided grin tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're not asking me to let you go anymore," he teased, his voice thick with amusement. Clara's brows furrowed, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. She shoved him away with more force than necessary and rolled out of bed, her back turned to him. It was childish, but she hoped he would chase after her, wrap her in his arms again. But he didn't. That silence stung more than any insult he could have thrown her way. Later, as they sat at the breakfast table, the air between them was stiff with unspoken feelings. The clinking of cutlery was the only sound filling the room, until Clara's phone buzzed. Her heart leaped as she picked it up. It was the hospital. The doctor on the other end of the line told her that her brother Liam was awake and asking for her. Without hesitation, Clara stood up, leaving her breakfast half-eaten, and rushed to change. As she bounded down the stairs, she spotted Nathaniel's eyes tracking her movements, his brows drawn together. "You were just going to leave, without telling me?" he asked, his tone low but laced with tension. "I assumed you had a meeting at the firm this morning," she replied casually, brushing off the intensity of his stare. "I'll drive you," he said, already rising from his chair. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Clara tried, more than once, to make small talk, but Nathaniel remained cold, his eyes fixed on the road, his responses clipped or non-existent. The silence between them echoed louder than any fight. As they arrived, Clara remained seated, unable to open the car door. She turned to face him, placing her palms gently on either side of his face. "Nathaniel, I'm sorry," she whispered, searching his expression. He finally turned his gaze toward her and smiled faintly. "Say it again?" "Say what? Call me darling?" She rolled her eyes, but a laugh escaped her lips despite herself. "You're so cheap," she teased. He leaned in closer, his hand sliding behind her back. "Oh really?" he whispered, lips just brushing against hers. She could feel her resolve melting, her hands tightening around his neck, but instead of kissing her, he paused, resting his forehead against hers. "We're both shameless people." She blushed, flustered and flattered all at once, then quickly pushed him away with a laugh. When they stepped into the hospital room, Clara expected her brother to throw himself into her arms. But to her surprise, Liam ran straight to Nathaniel, throwing his arms around him in a tight hug. Clara froze, stunned. Liam didn't even look at her. He held onto Nathaniel's hand, chattering away, ignoring his sister entirely. Clara watched in growing confusion as the two carried on like old friends. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp, eyes narrowed. "Someone better explain before I lose my mind." Nathaniel turned toward her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I guess I owe you the truth," he began. "The day I saw you here, I started looking into Liam's condition. I assumed the worst, that you were selling off your shares to escape with someone else. But when I found out you were doing it to save your brother's life, I couldn't ignore it. I paid all of Liam's medical expenses, Clara. I asked the doctors not to tell you. I've been visiting him every day, 3 times in fact." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Emotion tightened her throat, tears threatening to fall. She had spent so long believing he was heartless, and yet, behind her back, he had done the one thing that mattered most. He had saved Liam. "I told Liam not to say anything," Nathaniel added softly. "So please, don't be upset with him." Clara's eyes brimmed with tears as Liam turned to her and tugged at her hand. "Uncle Nate told me I'll be a big brother soon," he said, his face glowing with pride. "I'm going to protect your baby girl." Clara couldn't hold back anymore. She pulled them both into her arms, overwhelmed by gratitude, love, and the unexpected ways life had shifted. Months passed. In a softly lit bedroom, Clara cradled their newborn daughter, Amelia. Her fingers gently stroked the baby's silky hair as the infant suckled peacefully. The door creaked open and Nathaniel stepped in, an exaggerated pout on his face. "Is it normal," he asked, "to be jealous of your own baby?" Clara blinked up at him in surprise. "Jealous? Why?" He leaned against the doorway dramatically. "Because since Amelia arrived, I've become invisible. I haven't had a single moment alone with my wife." Clara chuckled, setting Amelia carefully in her crib. As she approached him, she noticed that his usual teasing smile had faded slightly. There was a seriousness in his eyes. "You really missed me that much?" she whispered. In a swift movement, Nathaniel swept her into his arms, sitting down on the edge of the bed with her in his lap. His mouth met hers in a kiss that was both longing and homecoming. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, letting herself fall into the embrace fully. "I missed you too," she whispered between kisses. And in that moment, surrounded by warmth, love, and new beginnings, it was clear Clara and Nathaniel had both been changed by the chaos, pain, and beauty of their story. They had walked through fire and emerged stronger, finally learning that love isn't just about grand declarations or fiery passion, but about showing up, day after day, moment after moment, for the people who matter most. Clara and Nathaniel's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes love isn't loud, it's quiet. It's in the sacrifices we make, the forgiveness we choose, and the healing we allow ourselves to feel. Through pain, betrayal, and misunderstanding, they found a way back to each other, not because they were perfect, but because they were willing to grow. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it does open the door to a better future. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a relationship where love had to be rebuilt from broken pieces? Do you think Clara made the right decision in forgiving Nathaniel? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about love, healing, and second chances. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the next video we've prepared for you.